So our second snippet for this week looks at the very late 19th century and the early 20th century. So a couple of issues here. The first is imperialism. So here's a map of the American empire as it existed at the end of the 19th century. So the United States had seized several territories in the Caribbean, had seized Hawaii. Samoa was an American colony. The Midway Islands, right about here, is a colony. Alaska had been purchased from the Russians. The Marianas, the Carolines, and ultimately, after a quite brutal war, the Philippines. All of these territories which have been acquired share two characteristics. First, they are not contiguous to the lower 48 states. Secondly, with the possible exception of Alaska, there's no real census of Alaska at the time. These are majority and are overwhelmingly minority territories in an era where there is no sense that a majority minority state ever could be admitted. So for the first time in American history, the United States is not simply expanding, and have been doing that since its creation. It's expanding and seizing territories that those who acquire the territories do not believe ever will come in as a state. And they're doing so, at least in the case of the Philippines, after a brutal colonial war. There's a rebellion against the Spanish, which then becomes a rebellion against the Americans, headed by this man, Emilio Aguinaldo, who was a remarkably successful political leader. Aguinaldo's forces use guerrilla tactics, so they blend back into the civilian population. American forces, in response, use this euphemism called the water cure. We now know this as waterboarding. The idea is to capture a prisoner and to simulate they're being drowned in the hope that they'll reveal information. And this does actually work in the Philippines. And in 1902, the United States finally suppresses the rebellion. The question here for both the Philippines and Puerto Rico is whether full constitutional rights will be granted to these territories. Will they be allowed full access to the American market? These are agricultural areas, especially sugar producers don't want these places to get to the market. And this issue eventually percolates up to the Supreme Court in 5 cases, which are collectively known as the insular cases, which date from the early part of the 20th century. These cases are all victories for a more limited view of the Constitution. The question in these cases is, does the Constitution follow the flag? That is, when the United States acquires a territory that it does not believe will eventually become a state, does it nonetheless have to extend full constitutional protections to the people who live in that territory? And the court, you can see the rationale here in red on the screen, concludes that no, it does not. That the Constitution only applies to the contiguous 48 states. The dissent, one of his last dissents, is Justice Harlan, who again, gets it right and says that, how can it be if the Constitution creates Congress? How can Congress then pass laws that say the Constitution does not have authority over certain parts of the country? These cases have never been overruled. They remain good law in terms of the Supreme Court. It's true that through other mechanisms, constitutional rights have been extended to Puerto Rico and to the remaining U.S. colonies in the Pacific, but in some areas the tradition of the insular cases applies. So early 20th century, the first decade, the insular cases are one key area of decision. The second is this decision called Lochner, Lochner versus New York, which dealt with a New York law that was seen as a pro-labor law and allowed a maximum work week of 60 hours per week. So not much in terms of labor protection, but at least a little. This bakery sued and the case comes to be known as Lochner versus New York, and it makes it up to the Supreme Court. This is a case called where the key principle was substantive due process. Basically, what the Supreme Court concluded was that the rationale for this legislation just doesn't make any sense, and therefore the Supreme Court can more or less substitute its view. And its view of labor law is that a law such as the New York law violates the rights of those workers who wanted to work for 61 or 65 or 70 hours per week, and therefore was unconstitutional. The dissent from Justice Holmes says this is crazy, that of course states have the right to regulate economic activity within their jurisdiction, but this decision triggers a long run of cases over the next 30 years or so, where the Supreme Court will take some very conservative positions and also makes the issue of the power of the Supreme Court a question in political debate for really the first time since the Civil War. This is also a period, those of you who teach the American History Survey know this is the beginnings of the Progressive Era. And among many of the progressives, there's an attempt to either weaken the power of the court or change the structure of government. One of the most famous is this guy, Robert La Follette, who was a governor and then a 3-term U.S. Senator from Wisconsin, also publisher of La Follette's magazine. The idea of La Follette's magazine was to bring information about the workings of government to the people. And this was the first publication in the United States that published roll call votes. And the idea was that you had these politicians who would come back to their states and say, I vote for the workers or I vote for the farmers, and then they really wouldn't. And La Follette's was designed to protect that. In California, the progressive movement takes a somewhat different approach. This man is Hiram Johnson, who was the governor and then the senator from California, leader of the progressives in California. There's a change in the Constitution of California to allow for initiative, referendum, and recall. So recall is exactly what you would expect if a majority of the electors decide that they don't like the job that a governor is doing or a statewide official is doing. They can vote to recall that official, at which point the office becomes vacant and there's a new election. Initiative and referendum are lawmaking activities. So the initiative is if an interest group wants to propose a law, you can propose it, and then if you get a majority vote, they'll vote yes. A referendum is a way for the voters to disapprove of a law already passed by the legislature. This sounds like a really good idea, involving the people in decision making. It's turned out to be just a disaster. A typical ballot in California will be dozens of pages long. The initiatives are deliberately written in a confusing way, but the principle here is like La Follette's, but a different way, of having involving the people in decision making. And this peaks in the Theodore Roosevelt campaign of 1912, when Roosevelt runs as a third-party candidate. And Roosevelt's policies really aren't all that radical in the 1912 election, with one exception, and that's the power of the Supreme Court. And here you can see down at the bottom of the page, this is a Theodore Roosevelt court reform speech in 1912. What he's saying is that the power of judicial review should not be absolute. That when a court strikes down a law that the legislature, either the state or federal, had passed on behalf of general welfare, he's talking about Lochner-like decisions here, the Congress should have a right to overturn the court decision. So basically, what Roosevelt is proposing is a system in which the Supreme Court would no longer be the final arbiter of at least some constitutional disputes. This is a very controversial policy. One of the reasons why the incumbent Republican William Howard Taft, who has no chance of winning the 1912 election, chooses to stay in the race is because Taft is outraged by Roosevelt's policies and sees Roosevelt as more dangerous than Wilson in this respect. And then finally, the Progressive Era begins the surge of constitutional amendments. It's the last period with constitutional amendments in meaningful constitutional amendments in U.S. history. There are four amendments. The first two are primarily the work of these two men, George Norris, who was a Republican, very liberal Republican senator from Nebraska, and Joseph Bristow, who was a Republican and then a progressive senator from Kansas. We think today of Nebraska and Kansas as very conservative states, but in the early stages of the progressive era, they were actually quite left-wing states. And both Norris and Bristow want to, reform and conclude the only way to really do this is through constitutional amendments themselves. And two big ones which are passed in Wilson's, very start of Wilson's term. The first is to reverse a decision by the Supreme Court from the 1880s called Pollock versus Farmers Loan and Trust, which said that an income tax was unconstitutional because it was taking money from people beyond what was allowed in the Constitution. So the 16th Amendment is designed to allow the federal government to impose income taxes. These are very low rates until the post-World War II period. And then the second key amendment from Norris and Bristow is the direct election of senators not to allow state legislatures to do so. And the thinking here was that state legislatures in the late 19th and early 20th centuries often were very corrupt. I'm speaking on the night where some of you might have seen the Speaker of the Ohio Assembly was arrested for a huge corruption scandal. So state legislatures are often quite corrupt. And the hope is that by putting the election in the hands of the people, that will allow more high-minded figures. It's going to return to the framers' idea of a virtuous man. I don't think any of us would argue that popular elections for senators have quite fulfilled this goal, but this is the Norris-Bristow approach. And the thing to keep in mind here in terms of the progressive era in this regard is the desire of these progressive era reformers to change the structure of government, either through the initiative and referendum in a place like California or through constitutional amendments like we see here from Bristow and Norris. So that's pretty much it for our second snippet.